Okay, I think we're on. Yeah, today I just wanted to talk about the governor's race in the state of New York. For those of you who don't live in New York, we've been subject to the reign of Andrew Cuomo well for too long. He's this is his hopefully this is his last reelection campaign, but he's been bandied about as a potential candidate for president by the Democrats, and it would fit in nicely with all the other rejects and liars and just unconscionably horrible people that are running for that nomination. To be honest, but he's basically continued to run New York into the ground, following in the footsteps of his predecessors, David Patterson and Elliot Spitzer, and on and on. So a lot of people are dissatisfied with his tenure, and that's why he had a Democratic primary opponent who garnered 30 something percent of the vote. I forget the exact percentage, but basically about a third of the vote, despite being a flaming uh, socialist lunatic, basically, and having no credentials other than being the an afterthought on an HBO series that was canceled years ago. But he does have opponents in the general election. One of them is the the requisite sacrificial lamb from the Republican Party, Mr. Molinaro, who I believe is from uh, who's from upstate New York, and he's run a pretty anemic campaign. I don't even think, honestly, I don't think he intended to ever put up a real race, unlike Rob Astorino, who unfortunately was crushed, despite having some pretty good policy ideas and being someone who actually could have, yeah, made some modest improvements to New York. But anyway, that's his ostensibly his main opponent. Although I really don't think he's run a campaign that you would consider an opposition campaign. He's basically the sacrificial lamb for this election cycle, which is what Republicans who have an anemic party apparatus, and it's basically a machine for nepotism and rewarding political insiders. They don't really have any intention of mounting serious campaigns, which is why there are no Republican state office holders. Uh, there, there, there hasn't been a competitive gubernatorial election in forever, and they're probably going to lose the state Senate. Andrea Stewart Cousins is going to be the Senate Majority Leader in all likelihood if things play out the way they do. There's actually one Republican candidate who's mounted a somewhat serious campaign for Attorney General, and he's hoping to rely on the anti-Cuomo backlash, perhaps, to vote him into office. But unfortunately, I don't see him being able to survive the blue tsunami, which nationally I think is a media generated myth, but in New York, it's pretty evident that the Democrats are going to win most, if not all, of the state offices and probably a lot of down ballot races. So into the field steps Larry Sharpe, who is the Libertarian Party candidate. You might be able to just see the shirt. That's his campaign logo. And as you can see, by the title of this video and by the T-shirt I'm wearing, I support Larry Sharpe, not because he's an outstanding not because he embodies everything I believe in. Even as far as libertarian candidates go, he's not the most groundbreaking candidate, but he has the right ideas on most of the problems that face New York, or at least he's posing the right questions. Even though the likelihood that he'll be elected is very remote, I think establishing some sort of beachhead for genuinely liberty-oriented ideas is important. So voting for someone who can actually dial down the regulation and taxation and just overweening oppressive state that's strangling ordinary New Yorkers, and it's basically it's turning New York into a replica of California, where you have a lot of very concentrated base of wealth, ostentatious and opulent living, like a very, very narrow elite who can afford to withstand the just disgusting levels of taxation, and a vast underclass, and a middle class that's being winnowed out, that just disappearing, and you have people disappearing, and it's a reflection. This is something even leftists point out, because it means a decreasing number, decreasing federal dollars. The fact that we don't have as many congressmen. We used to have, I think, the number of congressmen was somewhere in the 40s, and pretty soon eventually we're going to have under 20 congressmen, probably, or in that ballpark. And it's a reflection of how many people are just fleeing New York, going to North Carolina and Florida. And Larry Sharpe has pointed this out repeatedly. He himself was on the verge of moving out of state before he decided to make a last-ditch attempt to rescue rescue New York. And I think the idea that you shouldn't vote for a third party, I mean, to me, the arguments against it are absurd. First of all, just on a practical level, in this case, Molinaro has no chance at winning. If anything, he has he's less likely to make any sort of impact in this election than Sharpe is. And I don't think you can justify voting for him on the idea that he has a realistic shot of becoming governor, because he doesn't. And philosophically, it doesn't make sense to vote for him. You should at least cast your vote for someone who wants to repeal the SAFE Act, wants to pardon offenders, and wants to preserve some semblance of civil rights and civil liberties for New Yorkers. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to vote for Larry Sharpe. Those are just a few of them. But if you're still unconvinced, if you're a Republican or a conservative who's unpersuaded, I just suggest you look at the last debate between Molinaro and Cuomo, where he and other minor party candidates were excluded from. Look at that debate and tell me that Molinaro is worthy of your vote. I don't think you can justify it intellectually. I mean, if you want to vote for him, that's fine. I'm not going to begrudge you your vote. philosophically, I'm generally opposed to electoral politics, but in this case, I think it's worth. Um, excuse me. It's worth making a statement, a political statement, uh, and I think you can accomplish that by casting your vote for Larry Sharpe. If you don't want to, that's fine. Um, Cuomo is probably going to be our governor, at least for the foreseeable future, until he decides to run a laughably inept campaign for president, but or is indicted, hopefully, and put in prison. But it's just something to consider. I think Sharpe, again, despite not being the most impressive candidate to ever come down the pike, he was inspired to run for office by Gary Johnson, which is not. It's I think he's the only person who was inspired to join the Libertarian Party because of Gary Johnson, but he's a decent guy, and at least he has the right ideas on economics. So if you're kind of on the fence, I would suggest that you think about casting your ballot for Larry Sharpe.